Okay, welcome back. So, what can contemporary science tell us about stories and what makes a story inspire and motivate us? Well, one experiment conducted by Dr. Jennifer Aker of Stanford Business School presented an audience with the same information but communicated in two different ways: a pitch that was just the facts and a pitch that used story and narrative. And the point of the experiment was to test which of these pitches will be more memorable. And so they tested how well the information was retained by people who heard either one version that was facts only and the other version that was story based. Her team found that information presented in story form was 22 times more likely to be remembered afterwards. So this suggests something about stories and our brains, that our brains are conditioned somehow to process, respond to, and retain information that is presented to us in the form of a story. Now, why might that be, or how does that work exactly? Well, one way of thinking about perception, how we interact with our environment, relates to the idea of change and anticipation, that we respond to challenges and threats from our environment by filling in gaps, by making little predictions of what's going to happen next, that our brains are in a sense, prediction machines. This comes from the work of neuroscientists like Lisa Feldman Barrett, who suggest that this helps explain the fact that we're constantly making predictions of what's going to happen next, and we notice things that are different in our environment from things that are the same. That this creates a kind of a feedback loop where when we anticipate something that we think is going to happen, whether it's a threat or something positive, like about to have a nice meal, it triggers a hormone called dopamine in our brains, and this is pleasurable. And this was measured in a series of experiments with chimpanzees. The level of dopamine in the brain, either right before having a meal, during the meal, and after a meal. And you could imagine, well, when are you the most satisfied? Well, it might be after you've had the meal, or it might be during the meal. Well, what they found was that the level of highest dopamine actually was in the moment right before the meal, where they could see the bananas, but they didn't have them yet. That was where the chimpanzees' brains were reacting in the most pleasurable way. And chimpanzees, as we know, are about 98% similar to human beings. So I want you to think of how this works on each of us. And I'm going to share a little story of something that happened to me some time ago, where I had taken the late night flight into Rabat and had to find a cab at the airport. And it was a guy from the local town, Salah Al Jadida, and I didn't know this guy, and he said, "Oh no, I have a faster way to get to campus." And he took this kind of like route that I'd never been on before, and we found ourselves in this very dark street, and there were no lights, and it was very foggy, and all of a sudden, pulling up behind us was another car. It was the only other car on the road, and it was directly behind us, and it started flashing its lights. Now, reflect on how you're feeling right now. Are you picturing what it's like to be in a car late at night with someone you don't know on the road and something unexpected happens? Are you feeling a little nervous? Are you feeling a little anxious? Well, this is the effect of what we call mirror neurons. Mirror neurons were discovered by research scientists at the University of Parma in the 1990s. Similarly, we're using chimpanzees, I think bonobos in this case, and had wires in their brains that allowed the scientists to measure their different brain activity. And one day, one of the research assistants went out to lunch and came back with a gelato and was eating, and noticed that one of the bonobos, who still had the wire in her brain, was looking at her, the research assistant. And even though the bonobo wasn't eating anything, just looking at her eating, the same kind of brain activity was happening in the bonobo's brain as if it was the bonobo that was eating the gelato, even though the bonobo was just looking at her eating the gelato. And they thought that was kind of strange. And so this was the beginning of the discovery of what became known as mirror neurons, which is a series of circuits in our brain, or a phenomenon of our brain, in which images or the equivalent of images for humans, which are vivid stories, can create a kind of a instantaneous and unconscious simulation, as if it's ourselves and our own brains that are experiencing that thing that we're either seeing or, in the case of humans, hearing about in a story. Now, why do we have this circuit? Because these are the kinds of cognitive reactions that allow us to learn quickly from the experience of the story. How would we react in that situation? And also make social bonds unconsciously with the storyteller. We empathize or sympathize with the storyteller, and it brings us closer. And again, human societies have only survived by the strength of the social bonds that are created between members of the group. And so this is why mirror neurons exist. So this story I told you about the car, it didn't happen to me. It's a fiction. But because I was able to tell it, hopefully in something of a detailed and vivid way, you could picture, and literally your brain reacted as if it was you in that moment, in that experience. And so this is what good storytellers, by using visual imagery, are able to inspire in the brains of their listeners. So storytellers in literature and Hollywood refer to this rule as show, don't tell. C.S. Lewis, one of the most famous authors of children's books, expressed it this way. Instead of telling us a thing was terrible, describe it in such a way that we'll be terrified. Don't say it was delightful. Make us say, delightful, when we've read the description. I'll give you an example. If I wanted to transmit this information, this little pearl of wisdom, life often presents us with challenges that seem interminable. The best attitude is to begin with small and steady actions, which over time will get us to our goal. And then a friend comes along and says, that reminds me of a poem. "Oh, snail, climb Mount Fuji, but slowly, slowly." This haiku by the great Japanese poet Issa. Which one of these two versions of the same information are you likely to remember a week, a month, a year from now? Well, it would be the poem, because you can picture that snail at the bottom of the mountain climbing slowly, slowly. That's the way that we remember wisdom. That's one of the great uses of poetry and literature, is to transmit ideas about how to live, but in a way that's beautiful and memorable. So to summarize this section, our brains are conditioned by millions of years of evolution to respond to stories. That narratives are a kind of a social technology that work directly on our brain and circulate chemicals that can make us more vigilant, more attentive, more empathetic, and that this is not a magic process, that the great storytellers in Hollywood or in Marrakesh on the Jamal Fana are drawing on deep circuits that are embedded in our brains, whether that's the ability to stimulate dopamine through drama and suspense, or oxytocin, which is stimulated by vulnerability. It's the chemical that is released when we feel physical contact, when we hug someone. Oxytocin. That can be stimulated by a story where someone's vulnerable. Laughter, jokes, this stimulates endorphins, which make us more relaxed and creative. Threats stimulate cortisol or adrenaline. This makes us more alert. Some people love horror movies or roller coasters because they love that feeling of cortisol. Others, like me, tend to avoid roller coasters and horror movies, but some people love it, and it's a physical reaction in their brain. And then finally, stories that draw on group identity or pride generate this one of the things that generate the response of serotonin, which is linked to feelings of pride, self-worth, feeling recognized and valued. So narrative is something that is both deeply a part of our history and part of how our brains respond to information today. And this is something to keep in mind as we build stories that try to create social and political change.